From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I want to talk directly to the people at the Wildlife Refuge. You said you were here to help the citizens of Harney County. That help ended when a peaceful protest became an armed occupation. The Hammonds have turned themselves in. It's time for you to leave our community, go home to your families, and end this peacefully.
The standoff continues as armed anti-government militiamen occupy a national parks building in eastern Oregon for the fourth day. We'll speak with Richard Cohen of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which found the number of militias in the U.S. jumped 37% over the past year. We'll also speak with Janelle Ross of the Washington Post, who asks, why aren't we calling the Oregon occupiers terrorists? And we go to Portland, Oregon, to speak with Indigenous writer and activist Jacqueline Keeler on the history of the land that once belonged to the Paiute tribe. Then, the art of resistance.
When We Fight, We Win brings you behind the scenes of what we are reading in the newspapers today. It brings you behind the scenes of Black Lives Matter, it brings you behind the scenes of Occupy Wall Street, of the climate marches, of the public education movement.
From immigration raids to police killings, we'll speak with contributors to a remarkable new book that explores the growing resistance movement for justice. When we fight, we win. And 21st century social movements and the activists that are transforming our world. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran over the Saudi execution of a Shiite cleric have continued to spread across the region. On Saturday, Saudi Arabia executed 47 people, including Shiite cleric Nimr al-Nimr, marking its largest mass execution in decades. In response, protesters in the Iranian capital Tehran torched part of the Saudi embassy. Saudi Arabia responded by severing diplomatic ties with Iran. The Sunni-led nations of Bahrain and Sudan soon followed suit. The United Arab Emirates downgraded ties with Iran, while Kuwait said it would recall its ambassador there. Speaking Monday, Saudi Foreign Minister Adel al-Jubeir said Saudi Arabia would also end air traffic and trade relations with Iran.
We decided to cut off all diplomatic relations with Iran. We will also be cutting off all air traffic to and from Iran. We will be cutting off all commercial relations with Iran, and we will have a travel ban against people traveling to Iran.
Amidst the increasing isolation of Iran, protests against the Saudi execution of Shiite cleric Nimr al-Nimr have erupted across the region. In Bahrain, where hundreds of members of the Shiite majority have taken to the streets, police fired tear gas and birdshot at demonstrators. In Iraq, authorities said at least 2 Sunni mosques were attacked and 2 people killed in retaliation for the cleric's execution. Germany said it may re-examine its arms exports to Saudi Arabia after Saturday's mass execution. The United States, meanwhile, which recently approved a $1.29 billion arms sale to Saudi Arabia, has stopped short of publicly condemning the execution of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr. Speaking Monday, White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest said the Obama administration has raised concerns about the execution in the past.
And, this is a concern that we raised with the Saudis in advance. Unfortunately, the concerns that we expressed to the Saudis have precipitated the kinds of consequences that we were concerned about.
In Oregon, the armed right-wing occupation of a federally owned wildlife outpost has entered its 4th day. An anti-government militia calling itself the Citizens for Constitutional Freedom took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge Saturday in support of 2 ranchers sentenced to prison for setting fires that burned federal land several years ago. On Monday, the ranchers, Dwight Hammond Jr. and his son Stephen, turned themselves into federal authorities in California. The Hammonds have said the militants in Oregon do not speak for them. At a news conference Monday, Eamon Bundy, the leader of the militants, spoke out in defense of the Hammonds.
Myself and many, many, many others for weeks on end put all the energy we possibly could to try to keep them from having to go into this prison. And we feel that we have exhausted all prudent measures and have been ignored. And it has been left to us to decide whether we allow these things to go on or whether we make a stand so they will not happen to other people across this country.
Eamon Bundy is the son of Cliven Bundy, who had a standoff with federal authorities in Nevada in 2014. We'll have more on the occupation in Eastern Oregon after headlines. President Obama is poised to formally unveil a series of executive actions to address gun violence in the United States. The steps include expanded background checks for some gun sales and increased funding for federal law enforcement agencies. The actions fall far short of the reforms Obama had requested from Congress. Speaking Monday, the president said Congress still needs to act.
We have a frequency of mass shootings that far exceeds other countries in frequency. And although it is my strong belief that for us to get our complete arms around the problem, Congress needs to act. What I asked my team to do is to see what more we could do to strengthen our enforcement and prevent guns from falling into the wrong hands.
The United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Palestinian territories has resigned over Israel's refusal to allow him into the occupied West Bank and Gaza. Makari Nubisono said in a statement he had hoped Israel would grant him access as an impartial observer. But, quote, unfortunately, my efforts to help improve the lives of Palestinian victims of violations under the Israeli occupation have been frustrated every step of the way, he said. Turkish authorities say they have found the bodies of 21 people, including 3 children, after their boat sank as they tried to cross the Aegean Sea to Greece. It's the latest in a series of tragedies as refugees flee violence in Syria, Iraq, and other war-torn countries. Meanwhile, in the latest violence targeting refugees, authorities say several shots were fired at a building housing Syrian and Afghan refugees in Western Germany. One of the shots wounded a 23-year-old asylum seeker as he slept. The Obama administration's acknowledged agents detained 121 people, including children, in raids over the New Year's weekend as part of an operation to deport families fleeing violence in Central America. The raids took place mainly in Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas. The number of mothers with children and unaccompanied minors arriving at the U.S. border reportedly rose late last year amidst a spike in violence in Salvador and Honduras. New data shows killings in El Salvador increased by nearly 70% last year, meaning El Salvador could overtake Honduras as the world's most violent country. Republican presidential frontrunner Donald Trump has released his first campaign ad. The ad vows Trump will impose a temporary ban on Muslims entering the United States, quote, cut off the head of ISIS, and address immigration across the U.S.-Mexico border.
And he'll stop illegal immigration by building a wall on our southern border that Mexico will pay for.
Over that section describing the U.S.-Mexico border, video footage shows scores of people streaming over a border. But PolitiFact reveals the footage actually shows people crossing the border of a small Spanish enclave in Morocco. Asked about this discrepancy, Trump's campaign manager told NBC, quote, no expletive. It's not the Mexican border, but that's what our country is going to look like. This was 1,000% on purpose, he said. The Justice Department has sued German automaker Volkswagen after accusing it of installing devices in its vehicles to skirt U.S. emissions regulations. U.S. regulators say Volkswagen vehicles were emitting up to 40 times more pollution than U.S. standards allow. The lawsuit seeks billions of dollars in penalties. Florida authorities have acknowledged the state has a backlog of more than 13,000 untested rape kits. The report by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement says it could take several years and tens of millions of dollars to process the kits. The Florida backlog is part of a nationwide problem, with federal officials estimating 70,000 rape kits are currently languishing untested across the United States. Las Vegas police shot and killed an unarmed man New Year's Eve after mistaking his cell phone for a gun. Police responded after Deputy U.S. Marshals said they were pursuing a fugitive wanted for attempted murder. But the man, Keith Childress, was not wanted for attempted murder. He'd skipped a court date in Arizona after being convicted of other charges. Police body camera video shows an officer telling Childress to drop his gun, which turned out to be a phone. The other officer involved failed to activate his body camera. In South Carolina, Officer Michael Slager has been released on bond. He is the white policeman who was charged with murder after shooting unarmed African-American motorist Walter Scott in the back. Slager was released from jail on $500,000 bond, but will remain under house arrest. His trial has been set for October 31st. And Michigan Governor Rick Snyder is reportedly weighing whether to declare an emergency over contaminated water in the city of Flint. Governor Snyder apologized last week for the state's handling of the water crisis in Flint, where residents have reported serious health problems due to elevated lead levels. The contamination began after an emergency manager appointed by Governor Snyder switched Flint's water source to the long-polluted Flint River in a bid to save money. In August, Governor Snyder helped deliver 1,500 water filters to Flint, even as state officials assured people the water was safe. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The armed occupation of a federally owned wildlife outpost in remote Oregon has entered its fourth day. A self-styled right-wing anti-government militia calling itself the Citizens for Constitutional Freedom took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge Saturday in support of 2 ranchers sentenced to prison for setting fires that burned federal land. The wildlife refuge is located outside the town of Burns, Oregon, about 300 miles southeast of Portland. Leaders of the occupation include Eamon and Ryan Bundy, the sons of Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy. Cliven Bundy refused to pay decades' worth of cattle grazing fees, prompting a standoff with federal rangers in 2014 in Nevada, during which an armed militia rallied to his support. Cliven Bundy declared victory after the federal government backed down and released cattle they'd seized from him. The Oregon occupation also stems from a fight over public lands in the West. On Monday, the 2 ranchers whose cause the Bundys have embraced, Dwight Hammond Jr. and his son Stephen, turned themselves over to federal authorities in California for setting a series of fires on federal land, including one allegedly intended to cover up evidence of deer poaching. At a press conference Monday, Eamon Bundy spoke out in defense of the Hammonds.
As you may know, Dwight and Stephen Hammond are being forced to report to prison today for a crime they did not commit, and they've been put twice in jeopardy for. They've already served prison time for this already, and now they're being forced to go back again. They are a good ranching family that ranches not but just a few miles from here. And myself and many, many, many others for weeks on end put all the energy we possibly could to try to keep them from having to go into this prison. And we feel that we have exhausted all prudent measures and have been ignored. And it has been left to us to decide whether we allow these things to go on or whether we make a stand so they will not happen to other people across this country, so they will not come into our homes and take away our rights, and they will not come into our children's home and take away their rights.
That's Eamon Bundy. The Hammonds say he doesn't speak for them. Well, federal authorities have so far made no attempt to break up the armed occupation of the remote wildlife refuge in Oregon. Harney County Sheriff David Ward urged the militia to end its occupation.
I want to talk directly to the people at the wildlife refuge. You said you were here to help the citizens of Harney County. That help ended when a peaceful protest became an armed occupation. The Hammonds have turned themselves in. It's time for you to leave our community, go home to your families, and end this peacefully. Thanks for your time.
The Oregon occupation comes as a new report by the Southern Poverty Law Center found the number of militias in the United States jumped 37% over the past year. The center identified 276 militia groups, up from 202 in 2014. Joining us now is Richard Cohen, president of Southern Poverty Law Center. He's joining us from Montgomery, Alabama. Richard, talk more about what you found.
Well, you know, Amy, the number of militia groups, the number of extremist anti-government groups has really skyrocketed since Barack Obama took office in 2009. There was a bit of waning between 2011 and 2013.
But in the last couple years, we've seen a big increase, particularly in the number of militia groups, as you said, from about 200 to about 275. And this, I think, it can be traced directly to what happened at the Clive Bundy Ranch that you mentioned in April of 2014. You know, the government was there to collect grazing fees, or really to confiscate Bundy's cattle. Hundreds of, armed militiamen came to his aid and pointed guns at federal people from the Bureau of Land Management. And it really, it was an armed standoff. And very wisely, the federal government backed down. And immediately, not just Clive and Bundy declared victory, but the entire militia movement, declared victory. One militiaman who's very well known said, "Courage is contagious." And it really energized the militia movement. And that's what was responsible for the big increase that you referred to, a 37% increase.
So talk about Clive and Bundy's sons, Eamon and Ryan, moving from Nevada to Eastern Oregon.
Well, these are two young men where the apple didn't fall very far from the tree. They seem to be cut from the same cloth as their father. They are true zealots, true fanatics. Eamon is talking about being on a mission from God. And I think they are enjoying their newfound celebrity. This is not the first time that they've ventured across state lines in an effort to supposedly come to the aid of others. They were involved, or people connected with them were involved in another incident in Oregon at a mine where federal regulators were attempting to impose additional restrictions. People connected with the Bundys have been to the Mexican border to stop so-called illegal immigration. And, really, Eamon Bundy, I think, is someone whose own actions energized the movement. What happened shortly before the April 2014 standoff, was he got into a confrontation with some people from the Bureau of Land Management, tried to kick one of their dogs. They couldn't restrain him, and they ended up tasering him. And that was caught on a YouTube video that went viral in the militia movement and was responsible as much as anything for drawing hundreds of people to the Bundy cause.
So explain the fire that the Hammonds set, and then talk about their relationship with the Bundys. They're saying that the Bundys don't speak for them, but explain why they were sentenced to jail.
Well, they were sentenced to jail in connection with two fires, one in 2001 that burned over 100 acres, and one in 2006 that was much smaller. They claimed that they were burning their land in order to protect it from other forest fires. But the federal government had a very different view of it. They said they did it to cover up evidence of poaching. They were originally sentenced the son was sentenced to a year and a day, and the father was sentenced to 3 months. And then the government appealed that sentence, and they were resentenced under federal guidelines that required a mandatory minimum of 5 years. And that, that tremendous increase in sentencing was, I think, the thing that really sparked the hundreds of people coming to, kind of their side. And now that whole thing is kind of morphed into a dispute over, kind of the federal regulation of land, longstanding friction between ranchers and the federal government relating to the use of federal land. So that's how we got to where we are today. I'm sure that the Hammonds were heartened, or I assume the Hammonds were heartened, I should say, to have hundreds of people rally to their cause. A lot of controversy surrounding federal minimums. But I think when they saw, the violence associated with it, or the threats of violence, that they recoiled very wisely from that.
Richard Cohen, the Guardian's reporting that John Ritzheimer, a prolific creator of online propaganda against Islam, has joined the crew of militiamen in Oregon. Southern Poverty Law Center has written about John Ritzheimer.
Yeah, I can't tell you, Amy, that I know a lot about that. I'm sure it's available on our website, splcenter.org.
Well, I wanted to bring Janelle Ross in as well, a reporter for the Washington Post blog, The Fix. Janelle, you have a piece headlined, "Why Aren't We Calling the Oregon Occupiers Terrorists?" And you start by saying, as of Sunday afternoon, the Washington Post called them occupiers. The New York Times opted for armed activists and militiamen. The Associated Press put the situation this way: a family previously involved in a showdown with the federal government has occupied a building at a national wildlife refuge in Oregon and is asking militia members to join them. Take it from there. You're talking about disparate coverage of different kinds of groups.
I think so. I think the point, I suppose, that I was trying to make or highlight was just the sort of slow and very deliberate, careful pace at which it seems that we often move in our public discussions of these sorts of events, from describing individuals such as the group that are occupying this facility in Oregon as sort of principled individuals who are there to support a specific cause. And although they, in some cases, have come to the facility armed, and in the case of Ammon Bundy has said directly that while they are not looking for a violent confrontation, they are prepared to die there. This certainly is an indicator that some violence could occur. And it seems, a real effort to be very, very careful about how their actions themselves and what they are doing right now are described. The same certainly can't be said about the way, for instance, that coverage of various protests related to race and policing have been covered, or the fairly rapid way in which the activities of, say, a group or subset of people who may have been involved in rioting in those cases gets sort of mushrooms out and becomes the way that the entire group is described. In fact, I'm sure you, as well as many viewers, have seen, the sort of active conflation of protesters with rioters and looters and descriptions of them as thugs, etc., and a threat to entire cities and so on and so forth. And it's certainly, in light of that, very hard to imagine that the same kind of deliberate, slow, careful, methodical use of language would happen were there a group of, say, Black protesters who had decided to take over a courthouse while armed and threatening to fight to the death. It's very hard to imagine.
Janelle, I wanted to play this for you. On Sunday, CNN law enforcement analyst Art Roderick said the militants were being treated differently than Black Lives Matter protesters because, quote, they're not looting anything. Roderick made the remarks in an interview when he was being interviewed by CNN host Brian Stelter. This is Brian first.
It's going to become politicized. And we've already heard from activists online, many of them, I've been reading from them all morning, who say if these were Black Lives Matter protesters or if these were peaceful Muslim Americans, they'd be treated very differently by law enforcement. Do you think there's truth to that argument?
We're not talking about, I think you had mentioned it in the opening, because this is a very rural area. It is out in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. What are they actually doing? They're not destroying property. They're not looting anything. Right, exactly.
So there you have CNN law enforcement analyst Art Roderick. Your response, Janelle Ross.
My response to his opinion is not really necessary. I can only point out the obvious difference in what he said. I think that all Americans who have been paying attention to the news over the last 12 months are aware that there were, in fact, protests, and there were, in fact, some looters in Ferguson and in Baltimore, or rioters. But there was also no reticence at all about describing those individuals that engaged in violent activities as rioters or as looters. And in fact, what you saw is people describing the entire groups of people who came for peaceable protests, who were not armed, and were being described in all sorts of ways, including as straight up criminals and thugs, because of who they are, not because of what they were actively doing, even though much of this was caught on tape. And in this case, I think that while it is certainly true, factually, that these individuals are occupying a space in a rural area where there is little in the way of built infrastructure to destroy, even if that was what they were inclined to do, it is worth noting that these individuals have arrived armed, have said repeatedly that they are prepared to essentially fight to the death, and in fact are seeking an overthrow, or rather an end to federal government authority in specific areas, or in this case over specific pieces of land. That is a whole and altogether different thing than protesting and saying that you would like to see the justice system function in a different way.
Richard Cohen, president of the Southern Poverty Law Center, talk about how media coverage influences how different groups are treated.
Well, I'm not sure I can, I don't know if I really want to compare the different groups. I do want to speak to the issue of terrorism, if I could, for a moment. There's no doubt that there's been an enormous amount of terrorism over the years that has emanated from the radical right in our country. You know, the most spectacular incident, of course, was the Oklahoma City bombing carried out by people who had a hatred of the federal government and felt that it was overreaching. And since that time, there have probably been 100 different plots involving efforts to kill federal officials, poison water supplies, and all of that. So the Bundys come out of a milieu where there has been an enormous amount of terrorism. So I understand exactly why Janelle would want to kind of describe this as a terrorist incident. You know, there's been no violence yet, but you can imagine something far worse happening from fanatics like this. I think these people have been described by the media as fanatics, as zealots. There has been, I think, some reluctance to call them terrorists. I'm not sure why. We certainly wouldn't call the rioters or the people involved in a disturbance in Ferguson or Baltimore, wouldn't call them terrorists, but we would be very quick to, I think, condemn them. And I think people have been relatively quick, of course, to condemn the Bundys. Some, I mean, really quite, you know, I don't want to point fingers, but, you know, Sean Hannity, many Republican politicians originally portrayed the Bundys as heroic. You know, Ben Carson, Ted Cruz, Trump, Rand Paul, all talked about how, you know, the Bundys were standing tall against the man. And that type of portraying them as heroes, I think they should be held accountable for those kinds of that kind of encouragement that they've given them.
Of course, you contrast this, how the protesters here are being dealt with, to 1985, Janelle, to Philadelphia, when the Philadelphia police bombed the Move House, killing 11 people, actually dropped a bomb on their house. 11 people killed, 5 of them were children.
That is true. I think, of course, as Mr. Cohen said, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to make direct comparisons between groups and events and responses. There are always variables on the ground, certainly not the least of which in this case is the sort of urban versus rural setting. But there is, it seems at least, a sort of clear difference in the escalation of language and, or as Mr. Cohen pointed out, some real differences in the way that members of the media, but also the public, seem to think about and understand these individuals who are involved in different incidents. And it seems largely to be based on who they are rather than their cause, or even more specifically, what they're actually doing or not doing on the ground. And I would just come back to, all you have to do is look closely at specifically what Ammon Bundy has said about their goals and aims in Oregon and what they are prepared to do. And the fact that these occupiers have come to this space. They certainly have a right to assemble. They have a right to protest. This is the United States. That is certainly true. But to occupy a building is perhaps a different thing. It is not exactly the same as a protest. And further, to occupy a building while armed and to, in essence, invite a confrontation and say that it's going to end in violence is an entirely different thing. And there seems to be some sort of, I guess there are certainly some people who view, they may agree with the sort of underlying principles of their reason for gathering or occupying this space, but they have ascribe to that a whole series of very principled ideas and labels, which is noteworthy because it certainly affects both the way that these issues are covered, but also I think the way that law enforcement feels it is appropriate to respond, or how the public will react to law enforcement's response.
Janelle, I want to thank you for being with us. We're going to move on to Portland, Oregon, to look at the roots of the land in the area of Eastern Oregon. Janelle Ross, reporter for the Washington Post blog, The Fix. Richard Cohen, president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. When we come back, we'll go to Portland, Oregon. Stay with us. Selector by the Specials. Specials drummer John Bradbury passed away last week at the age of 62. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Obama administration, we're going to talk for a moment about the land dispute that's going on in Oregon. Jacqueline Keeler is with us. We are going to turn to the issue now of land rights. The armed militia members have demanded that the land be, quote, returned to them. But who really has a claim to this area? We're joined in Portland, Oregon by Jacqueline Keeler. She's a writer and activist of Diné and Yankton Dakota heritage who wrote about the 2014 Bundy Ranch standoff for The Nation magazine and is now working on a new piece which in part examines the history of the Paiute tribe's treaty rights to this very forest currently occupied by the nearly all-white militia. Jacqueline, it's great to have you on with us from Portland. Can you talk about what you've found so far? Tell us the history of this area in Eastern Oregon.
Yes. Well, I'd like to start off saying that today, in January, this is the 137th anniversary of when 500 Paiutes were loaded onto wagons and walked under heavy armed guard from the land where the Bundy are right now holding it, and to the Yakima Reservation in Washington State, some 300 miles, knee-deep in snow, and they were forced to march shackled 2 by 2. And so that's some of the background there.
And then continue. Take us through to today. What happened to this land? How did it change hands?
Well, the area now called the Malheur, it was called the Malheur Reservation, and it actually constituted nearly 1.7 million acres of land. And but with incursions from white settlers, they basically pressured the federal government to open it up to settlement. And so in 1876, President Grant did that. And then after there was an uprising with the Bannock Indian War in 1878, due to issues of starvation and deprivations, in the middle of winter again, the Bannock and the Paiute rose up, and then that's when they were forced marched out of the area and lost most of the land. I mean, they actually were allowed to return 5 years later, but they didn't really have a land base, so they were working for local ranchers. And until 1928, when the Egan Land Company gave the Burns Paiute 10 acres of land just outside the city, and the land was an old city dump, which the Indians cleaned and drilled a well to make ready for houses.
When you were writing about the Cliven Bundy standoff in 2014, you wrote, if the Nevada rancher is forced to pay taxes or grazing fees, he should pay them to the Shoshone. Explain.
Yes. The Shoshone, most of Nevada is actually covered under the Treaty of Ruby Valley. And that was signed in 1863. And it did allow for passage, of military and also, settlers crossing the land. And but it did not give up any land. So the Shoshone have never officially signed a treaty to give up land.
Jacqueline Keeler, I want to thank you for being with us. Just a little bit of history is always helpful. Writer and activist of Diné and Yankton Dakota heritage. Her forthcoming book is titled Not Your Disappearing Indian. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to our next segment, the Obama administration's begun conducting raids and detaining families across the United States as part of an effort to deport hundreds of Central Americans who fled violence in their home countries. At least 11 families have reportedly been detained so far. At one home in Georgia, a Honduran woman and her 9-year-old son were taken into custody after an early morning raid. The woman, Ana Lizette Mejia, reportedly fled Honduras after her brother was murdered by gangs. Her aunt, Johanna Gutierrez, told the Los Angeles Times Mejia was already under surveillance by the court, wore an ankle monitor, and attended all of her court dates. Gutierrez said her children were shaking with fear after agents woke them and searched the house at 5 a.m. Meanwhile, in Chicago, a prosecutor has asked the FBI to investigate the fatal shooting of an African-American college student and a grandmother last weekend. The student, Quintonio Legrier, was fatally shot after his father called 911 to report his son was acting strangely and carrying a metal bat. Police acknowledged they shot 55-year-old Betty Jones by mistake. Meanwhile, Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel's administration has released thousands of pages of emails revealing its year-long effort to contain the fallout from the shooting of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald last October. McDonald was shot 16 times by police. Police dash cam video, released only last month after court order, contradicts police accounts of the killing. What do the immigration raids and police brutality have in common? Well, they've both sparked growing social movements demanding justice. It's those linkages that are examined in a remarkable new book, When We Fight, We Win: 21st Century Social Movements and the Activists That Are Transforming Our World. The book looks at movements ranging from immigration to Black Lives Matter to the Fight for 15 to LGBTQ rights. We're joined by the author, education activist Greg Jobin Leeds, and two of the people featured in the book, Jitu Brown and Isabel Sousa Rodriguez. We're also joined by the book's art director, De Hernandez. One of the things that makes this book so unusual is the stunning artwork throughout. But I want to start on those immigration raids. Isabel, if you can talk about the significance of this new year, 2016 dawns, and what do we learn? That well over 100 people are being swept up in these immigration raids under the Obama administration. What do you know about them?
Yeah, it's very disappointing. It's heartbreaking that we have been betrayed so severely by the Obama administration. It was part of the inspiration of the Trail of Dreams. There were record numbers of deportations that were entirely unprecedented. You know, minority groups across this country were given this illusion of hope and change that was coming. And really, I felt at the time, and I feel again now, that many of our families, I came to this country from Colombia with my family, fleeing the violence that was taking place there. And in the same way that we fled a country where people were disappearing in the middle of the night and being taken by members of the government, by armed individuals, and put into unmarked vans, the same things are happening today in this country, and it's terrifying. And it's the reason why we stand up and fight, because we refuse to be dehumanized any longer. We want our families to be treated with dignity and respect.
Talk about your family's own immigration story and how you took activism into your own hands, not alone, but the march you went on from Florida.
So it all came about after I graduated from high school. I was dealing not just with my shattered dreams of being an undocumented student and realizing that the American dream was not accessible to me and individuals like me who are not recognized because they don't have legal status, but also because my family was experiencing deportation, was being forced out of the country because their political asylum cases had been denied. And I was seeing how enforcement kept increasing, detention centers were expanding their capacity, profit was being made off of our lives. And so the Trail of Dreams was really a desperate effort to try to inspire hope amongst young people, amongst families. From Miami all the way to DC, I reached out to my best friends from our youth group in the Florida Immigrant Coalition in Miami. And together we just believed that people out there wanted to join in the cause and wanted to stand up and say no more. And you know, our journey to DC got over 60,000 people around the country involved, engaged through social media.
Talk about some of the places you went to and what you confronted in the South.
We walked all through Florida, Georgia. In Georgia, the Ku Klux Klan had a demonstration where they wanted prayer in schools and an end to the Latino invasion. And they compared all immigrants to prostitutes and criminals. And we joined the NAACP in efforts to show that Black and Brown communities are standing together against the racism in this country, against the ways that we are under attack and are being dehumanized. And so, yeah, we went through South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, until we made it to DC with 8,000 people walking across the bridge to the Capitol.
You met President Obama?
I was invited, and it was interesting because in the period of the trail, I was sponsored by my U.S. citizen stepmother, and so I was the only one in the group that was given an opportunity to legalize their status. And so I received the invitation after multiple times that we had requested meetings with the White House and with the president specifically and had been rejected. We were told, oh, the president can't meet an undocumented person. You wouldn't be able to get through White House clearance. And so when they found out that I was the only one in the group that had an ID, I was invited. And so I knew going into that meeting that I wasn't going there as myself. I needed to be there representing everyone that gets left out of these meetings. Left out of being able to have a say in the policies that are affecting our lives. So when I arrived, I decided not to shake the president's hand as a way of expressing my disappointment and the sense of betrayal that the community has experienced under his administration, and our commitment to keep fighting and to hold the government accountable.
And what was President Obama's response?
It was interesting because they never expected that coming. I think I was told by Valerie Jarrett that he was very excited to meet us. They figured this is a meeting with a group of advocates. It's going to be nice, friendly, and the moment that I did that, it completely changed the tone of the meeting, and it made it a serious meeting about accountability, about the need for administrative relief, a need to end deportations. And it got a lot of conversations started that led to the passage of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
Do you feel the Dreamers did it?
I do believe that the Dreamers put everything on the line for their families, for their futures. We continue to fight all over this country, continue organizing, continue building meaningful relationships with other communities that are struggling in the same way, because we need equality and justice in this country, not just for immigrants, but for all of us who are being cast into the shadows.
We're going to break and come back to this discussion. Isabel Souza Rodriguez is one of our guests. She marched, walked on a long Trail of Tears,
Trail
of Dreams, as you put it, from Florida to Washington, D.C., then ultimately refused to shake President Obama's hand, though clearly the Dreamers changed Obama administration policy. When we come back, we'll be joined by others who are part of a fascinating project, a new book that's out. It's called When We Fight, We Win. Stay with us. We talk about a new book called When We Fight, We Win, 21st Century Social Movements and the Activists That Are Transforming Our World. Greg Jobin Leeds, talk about how you conceived of this book. You're a longtime education activist and philanthropist.
Thanks, Amy. Both my parents were refugees fleeing war in a very similar way to Isabel's story. And I owe my very existence here to life because some people stood up and spoke out for them as Jews fleeing Germany.
Talk about what happened to them there.
So my father cleaned up the temple after Kristallnacht. My mother was refugee.
Kristallnacht being
the night of broken glass, where the streets were filled with glass, where temples and stores were smashed. And he cleaned up the temple. Luckily, they had an immigration number and they were able to get in. Otherwise, he would have gone the way of Anne Frank, whose family died in the concentration camps. And my mother was a refugee 2 times, fleeing war before she was age 11. And so these stories that Isabel talks about and so many are very personal to me. But people did speak out for them, and that's why I'm here. But not enough people spoke out. And so my sense is that we have to be the ones who speak out against these incredible deportations, against the incredible wars that we're creating. And so I interviewed brilliant activists like Isabel, like G2 Brown, and worked with the most amazing artists like Day Hernandez to figure out what are the key things that activists can do and what makes movements tick and how to make them more transformative.
Well, G2 Brown, you mentioned, we have spoken to in Chicago a number of times, and he's joining us from Chicago right now. Talk about activism and how it is shaping Chicago. I mean, you now have the mayor, Rahm Emanuel, who is under siege. Did I just hear that the Illinois state legislature is weighing whether to have a recall election?
Yes, ma'am. Well, first, good morning, Amy.
It's good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. I think what's inspiring about the organizing that's really been happening in Chicago over the last few years is that communities that are taught by design that there's no way they can win, that you just have to go with the flow or go along to get along or accept second and third class citizenship, have been fighting back. And in a hyper-segregated city like Chicago, you see people struggling together across race, across income levels. So not only in these issues of police violence, but around the issue of public education. And what's beautiful is that the fights are no longer just issue. And what's beautiful is that the fights are no longer just issue-based, which is, it tends to be sort of what happens. It's around a shared set of values. What type of world do you want to see? How should policing look in our communities? We will not accept that that a normal response for police officers is to shoot down the people that they're paid to protect or should be paid to protect. So I think that the work of young people in this city, BYP 100, Black Lives Matter, Assata's Daughters, has been really pushing the powers that be to the limit.
And you, like Greg, a long-time education activist, we last spoke to you when you were on hunger strike protesting the closing of a school in a community of color.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you think it is possible Rahm Emanuel will be forced to step down? In the latest killings just last weekend, Quintonio LeGrier, as well as Betty Jones, you have the police saying they made a mistake when they killed Betty Jones. She's the one who opened the door for the police. You don't hear them saying that with Quintonio LeGrier, whose own father called the police to say, help me with my son.
Let's remember that Mayor Rahm Emanuel closed mental health centers when he first got in office. So we don't know if Quintonio had mental health issues, but if you have someone who is struggling, the response should not be to kill them. The response should be to be able to bring that person down in a way that's humane, the way that's that can get them treatment that they deserve, or if they need to be incarcerated, that can make that happen. But the response should not be to shoot them 7 times, to shoot them 7 times. And you don't hear any sense that from the police that that's outrageous. So I think what you see is that it's a part of the Chicago culture that is really just accelerated under Mayor Rahm Emanuel. The privatization of schools has accelerated under Mayor Rahm Emanuel. So I believe that he is in danger. I think that he is fighting for his political life. And I think he deserves it. I think that his lack of willingness to look at people in our neighborhoods as valuable, as people that can actually make a contribution to Chicago, is racist, is arrogant. It has caused pain and suffering in people's lives. People have it harder than they did before he came in office. And, you know, that should not be acceptable. We don't envision a world, we don't have some unrealistic view of a colorblind society, but we should have a colorful society. We should have a society where I shouldn't have to apologize for being who God made me. I shouldn't have to act as if I'm not proud to be Black, and still be able to work with Greg Jobin Lead, still be able to work with Day Hernandez, his brothers and sisters who respect what we each bring to the table. That's the world we're fighting for. And that's not the city or the world that he comes from.
Before we end, I want to bring Day Hernandez into this conversation with Ahitarte, which is like Agitart in English. You collaborated in When We Fight, We Win in a most magnificent way. I mean, this book is unique in the way it is framed by the art. Describe why this is so important in some of these images in your book.
In the recognition of art and culture as an essential part of building the movements. Ahitarte is an organization where I'm a resident artist, and Ahitarte is an organization made up of artists who are committed to creating projects and practices of cultural solidarity with workers and marginalized communities in grassroots struggles. And our work in When We Fight, We Win was definitely creating that art narrative, recognizing that most often we forget that the narratives are controlled by those in power, and that there's certainly art and culture created within the communities of amazing souls and amazing artists who hand by hand with activists are changing those narratives and creating a new culture where we can create that liberation.
One of the people you collaborated with also made one of the big bread and puppet-like art pieces in the Climate Justice March. Describe that of Mother Earth.
Yeah.
That became the image of the march.
So that one in particular, we created with El Puente, with El Cadre Folksum Puente in Brooklyn. Also a organization that's been based on more than 40 years in Los Sures. And the giant puppet, more than 14 feet, and it's actually our biggest puppet, was created in, I would say, like 2 weeks. And we wanted the face of we're thinking of the Pachamama, so a resemblance of Mother Earth, but also a resemblance of all the single mothers and brown and black bodies that are raising.
Well,
children.
before we go, Greg, you're traveling the country now. Tonight, you're going to be launching the book at Powerhouse Arena in Brooklyn and Dumbo, a big multimedia display, art, stories. And where do you go from here, from Brooklyn to Boston?
So 7 p.m. tonight at Powerhouse. We'll be in Cambridge on Thursday at 7 p.m. at Harvard Books. We'll be in D.C. At Busboys and Poets on Tuesday the 12th. We're back in Boston. Then we go to Chicago, Seattle,
Your website
Portland,
is?
And When We Fight, We Win. WhenWeFightWeWin.org. And
as you bring together movements all over this country, once again, the very movements you documented. I want to thank you all for being with us. Greg Jobin Leeds, Day Hernandez, G2 Brown in Chicago, and Isabel Souza Rodriguez. Best of luck on your journey. The book again, When We Fight, We Win, 21st Century Social Movements and the Activists That Are Transforming Our World. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Carla Wills, Laura Gaddis-Diener, Dina Guzder, Amy Littlefield, Sam Alcoff, Robbie Karen, Steve Martinez, Hani Massoud, Juan Carlos Davila, Pedro Rodriguez, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, engineer. Special thanks to Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.